What if everything we thought we knew about Princess Anne and Princess Diana's relationship was only part of the story? For decades, their differences were well documented. Anne, the no-nonsense royal dedicated to duty, and Diana, the beloved people's princess who challenged tradition. The public perception was clear. They were distant, with little in common. But years after Diana's passing, an unexpected reflection from Anne added a new layer to their history. Did Diana confide in Anne more than anyone realized? How did Anne react to Diana's struggles behind palace walls? And in the years that followed, did her perspective on Diana change in ways no one expected? For years, the relationship between Princess Anne and Princess Diana was overshadowed by speculation, misinterpretations, and assumptions. The media often portrayed them as distant, even cold toward one another, fueling the idea that they had little to no connection. But decades later, an unexpected confession from Princess Anne brought new insight into their dynamic, revealing a truth far more complex than the public had ever known. From the moment Diana entered the royal family, it was clear that she was unlike anyone who had come before her. At just 20 years old, she captivated the world with her charm, vulnerability, and deep connection to the public. She was adored not only as the wife of the future king, but as a figure who brought warmth to an institution known for its strict traditions and emotional restraint. Princess Anne, on the other hand, was the embodiment of royal duty, practical, disciplined, and completely uninterested in the praise or attention that Diana seemed to attract effortlessly. Anne had grown up under the unwavering influence of Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip, learning that personal feelings had no place in the service of the crown. Even before Diana's marriage to Prince Charles in 1981, Anne had little interest in getting to know her soon-to-be sister-in-law. Unlike other members of the family, Anne did not make any visible effort to welcome Diana into royal life. There were no moments of warmth captured by the cameras, no friendly gestures that suggested a bond between them. When reporters asked Anne about Diana in the early days, her response was brief and indifferent. She simply stated that she had no time for the media frenzy surrounding Diana's entrance into the family. To many, this was evidence that Anne had dismissed Diana from the beginning, unwilling to acknowledge the new princess who was quickly becoming the most famous woman in the world. Diana, eager to establish herself within the family, attempted to reach out in subtle ways. In the months leading up to her wedding to Prince Charles, she made an effort to follow royal protocols, ensuring that she greeted senior members of the family with the formality expected of her. But when it came to Princess Anne, there was an immediate barrier. Anne, never one for unnecessary pleasantries, reportedly barely acknowledged Diana's presence on several occasions. While other members of the family were at least polite, Anne made no secret of her belief that Diana was too emotional, too invested in public admiration, and too concerned with how she was perceived. As the years went on, the divide between them only grew. Anne's dedication to royal duty had always been unwavering. She carried out her engagements without complaint, never seeking the limelight, and often refusing to engage with the press. While Diana's humanitarian work was praised across the world, Anne worked just as tirelessly behind the scenes, advocating for charities and causes with little media attention. It was this stark difference that fueled tensions between them. Diana's every move was reported, analyzed, and admired, while Anne's years of service largely went unnoticed by the public. Some royal insiders believed that Anne resented this, not out of jealousy, but because she felt that duty should not be measured by media recognition. One of the most significant moments that deepened the distance between them came after the birth of Prince William in 1982. As tradition dictated, the selection of a royal child's godparents was an important decision, often involving senior family members. Many believed that Anne, as Charles's sister, would naturally be chosen as William's godmother. But Diana had different ideas. She selected individuals who were personally meaningful to her rather than adhering to traditional expectations. Anne was not on the list. The decision was unexpected, and to some, a clear statement that Diana was willing to break royal norms when it came to her children. When Prince Harry was born 2 years later, the same pattern followed. Once again, Anne was not chosen. While Anne never publicly commented on it, her absence at Prince Harry's christening was noted. Instead of attending the family gathering, she remained at her Gloucestershire estate, hosting a hunting party. Whether this was a deliberate statement or merely an unavoidable scheduling conflict was never clarified, but the speculation remained. Despite their differences, there were rare moments when Diana and Anne's paths crossed in more meaningful ways. By the early 1990s, Diana's marriage was unraveling in full view of the world. The once carefully curated image of the fairy tale princess was beginning to fade, replaced by tabloid stories of emotional distress, public loneliness, and an increasingly fractured relationship with the royal family. During this time, Anne remained silent, never commenting on Diana's struggles or engaging in the growing media frenzy surrounding her. Unlike other royals who tried to defend the monarchy's position, Anne simply carried on with her duties, unaffected by the storm that surrounded Diana. What the public never saw, however, were the brief but significant interactions that took place between them behind closed doors. While Anne had little patience for emotional displays, she was also known for her blunt honesty, something that, surprisingly, Diana came to appreciate in small ways. In one instance, during a royal event in the early 1990s, Diana reportedly confided in Anne about the growing pressures she faced, both within the family and in the relentless media coverage of her life. Unlike others who either dismissed Diana's concerns or advised her to endure them silently, Anne offered a response that was, in its own way, an acknowledgement of the difficulty Diana was experiencing. She did not offer comfort, but she did not dismiss her either. Instead, she pointed out that the expectations placed on Diana were not unique. Every member of the family had their struggles, their sacrifices, and their own form of isolation. While it was not the warmth Diana may have hoped for, it was one of the few times a royal had acknowledged that her challenges were real. This moment did not transform their relationship, nor did it create a lasting bond between them. But it was a rare instance in which Diana was met with something other than cold indifference. It was a moment that, years later, Princess Anne would reflect on differently. At the time, it had been nothing more than a brief exchange, one of many that took place between members of a family that rarely spoke about personal struggles. But after Diana's passing, those words would take on a new weight. As Diana's situation grew more difficult, Anne remained on the sidelines, watching from a distance as the younger princess's life became more complicated. By the time Diana sat down for her now infamous interview with the BBC in 1995, revealing the deep fractures in her marriage and her struggle within the royal system, it was clear that there was no turning back. The monarchy was shaken, and Diana had firmly positioned herself outside of its traditions. While Anne, like the rest of the royal family, was undoubtedly displeased with the way Diana chose to handle her struggles, she also understood that Diana had reached a breaking point. It was one thing to remain silent for the sake of duty, as Anne had done her entire life. It was another to be trapped in a role that no longer felt survivable. Diana's departure from royal life in 1996, following her divorce from Prince Charles, marked the beginning of her final chapter. She was no longer bound by the expectations of the crown, but she was also without its protection. In the months that followed, she embarked on a new phase of her life, one filled with humanitarian work, new relationships, and a growing sense of freedom. Yet despite this, she remained acutely aware that she was walking a delicate path. The events leading up to Diana's tragic death in 1997 would bring an irreversible change to the monarchy and, in many ways, to Princess Anne herself. What she had once viewed as mere spectacle had now become something far more profound, a loss that, despite their differences, would leave an impact that she had never expected. As the months passed and Diana moved further away from the royal family, her presence in the public eye only intensified. No longer bound by the constraints of royal protocol, she took on humanitarian work with renewed determination, throwing herself into causes that mattered to her. From campaigning against landmines to visiting AIDS clinics, she was shaping a new identity, one that existed outside the monarchy's carefully maintained image. But despite this transformation, she remained acutely aware of the dangers that came with it. Without the protection of the institution, she was exposed in ways she had never been before. Anne, meanwhile, continued as she always had. Uninterested in media attention, she remained one of the hardest-working members of the royal family, carrying out engagements with little fanfare. She had seen too many newcomers struggle to adapt to the life she had been raised in, and in her mind, Diana had been no exception. While the rest of the world watched Diana's evolution with fascination, Anne saw a woman who had made her choice to step outside the royal fold, and believed that she had to face the consequences of that decision. But even she could not ignore the storm that was beginning to build around Diana in the final months of her life. By the spring of 1997, Diana's life had taken yet another dramatic turn. Her relationship with Dodi Fayed, the son of Egyptian billionaire Mohammed Al Fayed, had become the subject of relentless tabloid speculation. Their movements were tracked at every turn, with paparazzi following them from London to the Mediterranean. While Diana had long been used to the invasive nature of the press, the attention surrounding her in those months was unlike anything she had ever experienced before. She spoke to friends about her growing frustration, about the feeling that she was being watched more than ever, and about the unease she couldn't quite shake. Anne, like the rest of the royal family, kept her distance. While there were concerns about the way Diana was being pursued by the press, there was little intervention from the monarchy itself. The institution had always operated under the belief that personal matters should remain just that, personal. It was an approach that Anne had followed all her life, and she saw no reason to change it now. To her, Diana had removed herself from the royal framework, and it was no longer their place to involve themselves in her affairs. Diana's final weeks were a whirlwind of movement. She traveled between London, Paris, and the south of France, spending time with her sons before embarking on what would be her last trip. By the end of August, she was in Paris, still accompanied by the ever-present paparazzi who documented her every step. On the night of August 31st, she and Dodi Fayed attempted to evade photographers as they left the Ritz Hotel, their car speeding through the streets of the French capital. Moments later, the world would be shaken by the news of the crash that ended Diana's life. In the immediate aftermath, there was a sense of disbelief. The woman who had captivated millions was gone, and the royal family found itself at the center of a growing wave of criticism. Their initial silence was widely condemned, with the public demanding to see a display of grief from an institution that had long remained emotionally reserved. While Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Charles eventually addressed the nation, Anne's reaction remained largely unseen. Unlike her brother, who traveled to Paris to bring Diana's body back to Britain, Anne did not make any public statements. But those who were close to her later remarked that she had been more affected than people realized. In her own way, Anne understood loss. She had always been pragmatic about the realities of royal life, knowing that sacrifices came with the role. But Diana's death was different. It was not the loss of a royal, but the loss of a mother, a woman who had spent the last years of her life fighting to remain present for her children. For Anne, who had spent much of her own life balancing duty and motherhood, there was an unspoken understanding of what had truly been lost that night. As the days passed and the world mourned, Anne remained out of the spotlight. She attended the funeral on September 6th, walking behind the coffin as it made its way through the streets of London. While Charles and the young princes bore the weight of public scrutiny, Anne was there in quiet solidarity, standing alongside her family as they faced one of the most defining moments in modern royal history. Though she never expressed it openly, those who observed her in those days believed that Diana's death had left an impact that Anne herself may not have expected. It was a reminder that despite their differences, Diana had been part of the same world, bound by the same expectations and the same challenges. And now, she is gone. In the weeks following Diana's funeral, the royal family faced an unprecedented wave of scrutiny. The public outcry over their initial silence had forced them to reckon with the reality that times were changing, that the people expected something more than distant formality. The Queen's address to the nation had come only after significant pressure, and while it helped ease tensions, the damage had already been done. For many, it seemed as though the monarchy had failed Diana in life and in death. Anne, however, remained as steadfast as ever, refusing to engage with the emotional responses that flooded the media. She continued with her royal duties as expected, adhering to the belief that the best way to move forward was simply to carry on. But those closest to her noticed a shift, something subtle but undeniable. Anne had always been viewed as one of the strongest members of the royal family, a woman who never sought approval from the press or the public. She had been raised to prioritize duty above all else, rarely showing emotion even in the most challenging of times. Yet, after Diana's passing, there was a noticeable change in how she approached certain aspects of royal life. While she never spoke openly about Diana, she became a more vocal advocate for a streamlined monarchy, one that would focus less on maintaining a large working royal family and more on efficiency. In the years that followed, she repeatedly expressed the view that not every member of the royal household needed to take on public duties, a stance that aligned, perhaps unintentionally, with Diana's own vision for her sons. Despite their strained relationship, Diana had always been clear about one thing. She wanted her children to have as much of a normal life as possible. She was determined that William and Harry would not be entirely consumed by the expectations of royal duty, that they would have a childhood free from the emotional restraint that had defined generations before them. In her final years, she spoke about wanting them to grow up understanding the world outside of the palace, to experience friendships and education in ways that were not dictated solely by tradition. While Anne never publicly aligned herself with Diana's perspective, her actions in later years suggested that she understood on some level why it mattered. As time passed, Anne became one of the most consistent figures in William and Harry's lives. While the media focused on the roles of Charles and the Queen, Anne remained quietly present. She had always been a firm but supportive figure to her own children, and in the aftermath of Diana's death, that approach seemed to extend to her nephews. She never sought recognition for it, nor did she speak about it in interviews, but there were moments when it became clear that she had taken on a role that few had expected. Her practical nature and unwavering commitment to family made her someone the young princes could rely on, even if it was never publicly acknowledged. Over the years, Anne's views on the evolving nature of the monarchy became more apparent. She was not opposed to change, but she believed in a monarchy that functioned efficiently, without unnecessary excess. As discussions about the future of the royal family continued, her voice was one of the most pragmatic. She saw firsthand how the pressures of public life had affected Diana, how the media intrusion had played a role in her struggles, and she understood why William and Harry might seek something different. Though she never explicitly tied her views to Diana's experience, there was an undeniable connection between what Anne advocated for and what Diana had once hoped for her sons. While the world moved on, Diana's legacy remained firmly embedded in the royal family's narrative. Her influence was visible not only in the way her sons approached their roles, but also in the broader conversations about what it meant to be a modern royal. Anne, in her own way, adapted to that shift. She never sought to rewrite the past or change the perceptions people had of her relationship with Diana. But she also never refuted the idea that things could have been different. The two women had never been close, their lives shaped by vastly different ideals, but they had shared an experience that few could understand. They had both, in their own ways, struggled with the constraints of royal life, and while they had handled it in vastly different ways, there was an unspoken understanding that neither of them had ever fully acknowledged. In private conversations with those she trusted, Anne rarely spoke of Diana. She was not one to dwell on what had been or what might have been. But for those who had observed her over the years, it was clear that something had changed. Her approach to duty remained the same, but there was a quiet acknowledgement that the world was moving forward, that the monarchy had to evolve if it wanted to survive. Diana had seen that long before anyone else, and though Anne would never openly admit it, there were moments when it seemed as though she had come to see it too. The royal family continued to navigate a changing landscape, with new challenges emerging as the years went by. Public expectations continued to shift, and the younger generation of royals, led by William and Harry, took on their roles with a level of independence that had not been seen before. Anne remained at the heart of the institution, steadfast in her responsibilities, but increasingly aware of the delicate balance between tradition and progress. In the years following Diana's passing, she had watched as the monarchy slowly adapted to the modern era, as it learned, sometimes the hard way, that change was not something to be feared, but embraced. Though Anne would never be one to offer public reflections on Diana, her actions spoke louder than words. She had never been one for sentimentality, but she understood loss in a way that only someone who had devoted their life to the crown could. And in that understanding, there was perhaps a small recognition of the woman who had once stood beside her, fighting a battle that no one else had truly seen. Years after Diana's passing, the monarchy had settled into a new rhythm, one that attempted to balance the weight of tradition with the increasing demand for modernity. The world had changed, and so had the expectations placed upon the royal family. Diana's influence, whether acknowledged openly or not, had left an indelible mark on the institution. Her sons, William and Harry, had grown into men with distinct views on their roles, each taking a different approach to the responsibilities they had inherited. While William embraced his future as king with careful deliberation, Harry made the unprecedented decision to step away, choosing a life outside the constraints of royal duty. Through it all, Anne remained as she always had, committed to the monarchy, steadfast in her belief that duty came before personal desire. Yet despite her unchanging nature, those who watched closely saw subtle shifts, indications that even she had come to understand the lasting impact of Diana's choices. Anne had never been one for public displays of emotion, nor had she ever courted the press to share her thoughts on personal matters. Unlike other members of the family, she had no biographers shaping her legacy, no carefully curated interviews designed to manage public perception. She spoke only when necessary, and when she did, it was with characteristic bluntness. Over the years, as discussions about Diana's influence on the monarchy resurfaced time and time again, Anne refrained from participating in the dialogue. But there were moments, rare and fleeting, where her silence spoke volumes. One such moment came when she was asked about the changes within the royal family, particularly the younger generation's approach to their roles. Without hesitation, Anne acknowledged that the institution had evolved, that it was not the same monarchy she had been born into. While she did not credit Diana directly, those familiar with the history could see the connection. It was a quiet but telling admission that things had, indeed, shifted in a direction that Diana had once envisioned. Anne did not challenge the necessity of those changes, nor did she resist them, despite being one of the most traditional members of the family. Instead, she accepted them for what they were, a reflection of the times. Her relationship with her nephews remained largely private, but it was evident that she had been a steady presence in their lives. William, who had grown up preparing for a destiny that would one day place him on the throne, had found in Anne a figure who understood the pressures he faced. Her ability to navigate royal life without seeking public validation had, in some ways, become a blueprint for how William approached his responsibilities. Harry, on the other hand, had chosen a different path, one that mirrored the struggles his mother had faced decades earlier. His decision to step away from royal life was met with mixed reactions, but Anne, true to form, did not offer public commentary. Unlike others in the family who had openly expressed disappointment, Anne's silence suggested something different, not approval, but perhaps an understanding that some people were simply not suited for the life they had been born into. Diana had once confided in Anne about her fears for her sons, about the weight that would inevitably fall upon them as they grew older. At the time, Anne had not offered words of comfort or sympathy. She had simply stated the truth as she saw it, that being part of the royal family required sacrifice, that it was not a life that allowed for personal reinvention. Yet, years later, as she watched both William and Harry carve out their own paths, there was an acknowledgement, even if unspoken, that Diana had been right to worry. The monarchy was not an easy place to exist in, and the pressures it placed on those within it were not always sustainable. As Anne continued her work, her place within the institution remained solid. But there was no denying that the world around her was different from the one she had known in her youth. The monarchy had been forced to adapt, not only because of the shifting expectations of the public, but because of the challenges faced by those within it. Diana's legacy had become a defining part of that evolution, shaping conversations about the role of the monarchy in the modern age. Even as the royal family attempted to move forward, her presence lingered, a reminder of the ways in which tradition and change could collide. For Anne, who had spent her entire life upholding the values instilled in her from birth, there was no question that duty would always come first. She would never be the type to dwell on the past or reimagine what could have been. Yet, in the quiet moments, away from the public eye, there were signs that she had come to see things differently than she once had. She did not rewrite history, nor did she attempt to alter the public's perception of her relationship with Diana. But she also did not dispute the notion that Diana had left an impact on the royal family, on the monarchy, and perhaps even on her. The monarchy would continue to evolve, shaped by those who carried its traditions forward and those who challenged them. Diana had been one of the greatest disruptors in its history, a woman who refused to conform to expectations that did not align with who she was. Anne, in contrast, had been its anchor, the one who never wavered, who never sought to be anything other than what was expected of her. They had been opposites in almost every way, yet their stories remained intertwined, connected by the reality of the world they had both inhabited. As the years passed and new generations took their place within the royal family, Anne's role remained unchanged. She continued to serve, to work, to carry on the responsibilities she had accepted without question. But for those who had watched her closely, who had observed the way she had responded to the changes within the monarchy, it was clear that something had shifted. It was not a dramatic transformation, nor was it something she would ever speak about openly. But it was there, a quiet acknowledgement of a woman who had once stood beside her, who had challenged everything the monarchy stood for, and whose influence could still be felt, even decades after she was gone. With that, we have reached the end of today's video. If you have come this far with us, be sure to check out other videos on the channel.